top line here is this was an old-fashioned ass-kicking. Emphasis on the old-fashioned. And what I mean by this is like a traditional ass-kicking, right? And I think this is one of the better VP debate performances I've ever seen, and I've watched most of them going all the way back to the 60s. But this wasn't the like historic ass kickings like the ones that we saw in the past two debates. The one where I think Harris crushed Trump in the last debate, and where Trump crushed Biden, or depending on how you look at it, Biden crushed Biden, or Father Time crushed Biden. Either way, Biden had a historic loss, obviously, that led him to leave the race. It's not on that level, but I do think this was a clear loss. And let me tell you why. I'll read for you a tweet that I sent out halfway through the debate, which I think still holds. I said, halfway through this debate, my honest assessment is thus far, this is a traditional win. This is in traditional win territory for Vance, not the epic ass kickings we saw in the past two debates, but an old-fashioned rise above the expectations performance where he's consistently pivoted to his core message and story. And I actually think from then on, with one very important exception that I'll get to, he continued to perform well. Now, Walz heated up throughout the debate, but he still had some weird stumbles, and I don't think he conveyed a core message throughout the debate, and certainly didn't do a good job of pushing back against what, in my assessment, were blatant fabrications or distortions by Vance, right? And this is not a fact-checking podcast. You don't have to agree with me that those distortions existed, and I suspect that if this debate has staying power, we'll do more on the fact-checking front, but this is a quick reaction, and I think I would need the muscle power of like a full-on artificial intelligence machine to fact-check the amount of information that we just got. But some top lines here. What I think here, what we saw was more hillbilly elegy Vance than, cat lady edgelord Vance. And this is expected. If you've been listening to this podcast, if you follow me on Twitter, I was very nervous as a Democrat about this debate. I don't think the Democrats should have agreed to it. I don't think Democrats should have let this be the last collective moment of the campaign, because the expectations were so low of Vance and his capabilities are so high that was a dangerous combination. And he rose to the occasion. He was very crisp. There's not a lot of stuff that came out of his mouth that I agree with. There's certainly a lot of things that came out of his mouth that I think were not correct or honest, but he did what he had to do. He pushed a core message. He pivoted to his story. He defended Trump. He attacked Harris. And he did so with, I think, a pretty interesting strategy. Whoever prepared him, whether it was him, it was his wife, or whoever, Tom Emmer, they did a good job in preparing him. Now, on the flip side, Walz from the get-go was extremely nervous. And I've often talk about the first 10 minutes are the most important part of the debate. Walz from the get-go was very clearly nervous. He wasn't as coherent as he should have been. He got better with time, but he was still, even at his best, rarely had an answer for which, even like head-to-head on a given issue, he was better than Vance. And again, I'll get to one exception here that I think is important. Now, this was also, I think, a little bit more civilized than other debates we've seen. There were some warm moments, and there were quite a few moments of Tim or JD said something I agree with that they were saying to each other. Now, I think Vance in particular deployed this smartly. There were various points in which Vance would sandwich I agree with Walz in between like very barbed attacks. And so if you're listening to it, you're like, oh yeah, this is a nice guy. He's willing to like concede certain things. But if you listen carefully, he really didn't concede anything. He was often inserting really sharp attacks in between like on either side of what seemed to be a compliment. And there were a couple moments where he was like, I agree with Walz, but Walz doesn't agree with Harris, right? He was saying, those aren't exact words, but he was making that point. Walz did something similar later on. I think that technique is particularly effective when deployed. I think Walz was also out of his depth on policy, generally speaking. Vance was like near Ben Shapiro levels of speed and just throwing out like all kinds of explanations that, if I was watching dial testing on this, if there was a surprise, I don't think there's going to be a surprise. I have not heard anything on the dial testing, which usually means that they weren't good, because normally when the dials are good, I get Democratic operatives sending them to me left and right. But if there was a surprise on dial testing, and as I'm speaking right now, the networks are going through their focus groups. If there was a surprise, it would be maybe some voters are like, Vance spoke too fast. He seemed too slick. Maybe Walz's like clumsy nature was endearing. You know, there were a few moments where I think he knocked home issue-specific points. Maybe that mitigated the damage. But even with the speed that Vance was speaking with, I do think the repetition, like consistently going back to his mom, his wife, the economy under Harris. He did the hit that I said last time that Trump could not land effectively and really didn't get around to the end of the debate. Vance consistently talked about how Harris's VP, why isn't she doing now the things that she's promising? And Walz really didn't say the obvious thing clearly, which is, hey, Trump, he's been president before. He reneged on a bunch of promises. Remember the wall, remember this, remember that, right? None of that, right? Walz could not muster that, and he certainly couldn't muster the issue-by-issue points. There was a super awkward moment when it came to immigration where Vance demanded time, and he clarified something where he was trying to say that the people of Springfield were illegal, right? Because the question was, you're calling them illegals. The moderator was like, they're not technically illegals. And then Vance was basically trying to say that he's basically trying to have a cute point about, well, I don't like this policy that allows these people to be here legally. Therefore, calling them illegal is warranted, right? That was my interpretation of it. I haven't obviously read the transcript of it. Walz tried to cut in. They cut off his mic and they cut off Vance's mic. And it's one of these interesting political moments where I see people on the right being like, they cut Vance off as he was trying to speak the truth. I tweeted out, they cut Walz out. He didn't get any word in on that when Vance demanded time that he wasn't entitled to. Now, is any of this going to matter? No. I personally believe you shouldn't call people illegal that aren't here illegal. But, that's a debate for another day. I'm simply here to talk about who was more effective tonight, not who was more accurate. The ACA, if you're talking about accuracy, there was this moment that I think really riled up a lot of my Democratic friends, especially in the Obama world, where Vance, this is a backhanded compliment, I admit, but Vance tried to argue, and maybe effectively did, that Trump tried to save the ACA, which is as this is as blatant a lie as anything I've ever heard on a debate stage. Walz did push back, but it really was pretty slick and blatant. I'll just read for you a tweet from my former boss, David Oxler, on this. He said, Trump has been promising a health care plan for 9 years. He tried 60 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act, 60 times without a replacement plan, and has said in this campaign, that he would try again to repeal it. Vance's account of this history is simply untrue. Now, do I know if it's 60 times? It was a lot of times, right? And he has been promising in this campaign to repeal it. Vance somehow got up there and said that Trump was trying to save the ACA. Now, and he said it crisply. He said it with a smile, and he said it fast. And a big question is how effective this will be. How many people tuned into this debate? Will this be clipped? Will people talk to their friends and be like, this Vance guy isn't as bad as I heard? Or will Democrats mount an effective resistance after this and say, clip all these things up with like aggressive fact checking, throw a ton of money behind it, and try to make the impression that this guy was a slick salesman for policies that are damaging to yada, 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 whatever Democratic message you want. That's going to be the game to play now. But I think Democrats start in this post-debate world at a disadvantage. Now, if I were to pick one clip that is going to make the rounds here, it would be the exchange around January 6th. And I'm not going to play it because I want to get this up fast enough so you guys can all listen to it as quickly as possible after the vice presidential debate. But you will see it quickly on the internet where Vance was asked about January 6th, and he refused to acknowledge that he would accept the election results here or that Trump lost the last election. And so that seems relevant. My read on 2022 was that the exit polling and overperformance of Democrats was first a reflection of Dobbs politics, but second a reflection of a lot of these insurrectionist candidates that Trump pushed around the country, right? The Doug Mastriano types, right? I think Vance talking like that could do him some damage. And you got to remember, I talk about this all the time. It's not just about what happens in the debate. Vance clearly won debate night. It also matters what clips have staying power after this. I suspect the clip that's going to come out for Vance first is going to be this particular clip around January 6th. I also think the ACA blatant lie will probably be there with Walz. It's hard to say because, a lot of his mistakes were just clumsy and like he was kind of bumbling. I think the part that I thought was least flattering to him was a question about Hong Kong and like distortions that Walz had around being in Hong Kong during the sort of, I guess, the key protests, or there was another Tiananmen Square moment or something. He started by saying the thing that needed to be said, which he was kind of like, I'm kind of like a, I say dumb things sometimes, and he basically implied I exaggerate and, it's not great. But then he kind of kept going and kept talking, and then the moderator pressed him on it, and it was just this weird, awkward silence where he kind of repeated some of the lines he said, but he didn't really do so in a convincing and compelling manner. I imagine that clip is going to is going to make the rounds. Now, the good news for Harris is that is not core to who Harris is. The bad news for Harris is that there was simply so much repetition of economic stuff, like hits on Harris and immigration hits on Harris, that in the moment felt way more effective than the responses from Walz, right? There were some exceptions, like when Walz pointed out that the Border Patrol union supported the border bill and all this kind of stuff, but I don't know. I would be shocked if more people came out of this favorable to Walz than already came in, or Harris than they already came in. One other outcome of all this is I doubt after this performance that Trump is going to agree to another debate, because I think he's going to look at this and say, all right, we got the last moment. We won the last moment, and we're going to move on, right? Now, of course, some people are going to say, Trump looks at this and now in his head now is like, oh, I can do the same thing to Harris that Vance did to Walz. I don't think that that's going to happen. Obviously, that would be the explanation for why Trump would then be encouraged to do a debate. I just don't think that's going to happen. Like, I do think the logic of campaigns and debates is going to win out. And historically, this has always been true. The campaign that feels like they are winning is not going to agree to another debate. And I think Trump, mistakenly probably, felt like he was winning heading into this debate. I think it was probably 60-40 Harris, as a lot of the models say. Do I think this is going to shift it 50-50? I mean, we got to see how many people saw this and what the staying power is here. This sort of conventional wisdom is VP debates don't matter. I suspect this will matter. Do I think it'll be decisive? I would be shocked. But in such a razor-thin race, every little thing matters. And this is not a little thing. It's not probably a massive thing. It's probably a medium-sized thing. But it could approach massive if nothing really happens of note between now and the election. So we'll keep an eye out. That's my honest assessment. My last piece of advice here is, I know we got a lot of liberal listeners here. And here's the litmus test for you. When you go on and you listen to these liberal podcasts, they're all my friends. I'm on some of their networks all the time. Listen tomorrow to what people say. If these people don't get on and admit the very obvious fact that Walz lost this debate, and that's not like a clear admission, then you should probably wonder whether you're listening to a news podcast or a series of political operatives that are there to manipulate you, right? Because I do know how a lot of these people think. They view themselves as an extension of the campaign. They really don't like to admit inconvenient information unless it's so obvious that it would create an issue with their audience, like the Biden debate performance. So listen carefully on that. I would go even further here to say that, and this is not helpful, but it's just, you come here to get my honest opinion, that in hindsight, which is the least helpful commentary out there, but I'm just here to tell you what I think. Watching Walz on that debate stage, I couldn't help but think if they picked Mayor Pete or they picked Shapiro, I feel like they'd be in a better position. I suspect And obviously it's also about being a good vice president and all that. But your job, number one, everybody says the job is to be a great vice president. BS. The first thing they look for in these vice presidential nominees is, can you help me win? And this was the most important moment. Walz has not been that public up until now. The hope was that he'd been preparing so much and that he was going to do so great tonight. He hadn't been really moving the dial publicly and doing a ton of interviews and all that kind of stuff, which maybe would have helped, by the way, his performance tonight. So he hadn't really been helping publicly up until now. He didn't do well in the one collective moment that he was responsible for, and perhaps the last collective moment of the campaign. If you're being honest, you're saying, look, nice guy, maybe a great vice president, maybe a good vice president, maybe an okay vice president, but he's thus far has not delivered on his core job, which is to be better than the alternatives in helping Harris win. That's my honest assessment, right? Inconvenient fact, but that's what I truly believe. And honestly, it's hard to argue otherwise, right? You can say he'll be a right vice president. He was the right pick for reasons of governance. But it's hard to imagine that he has maximized Harris's possibilities here in this race. And if you think about some of the alternatives, you could imagine them pushing back better and being more adept in a situation like this. Now, the Vance I saw today would have given anybody a hard time. And maybe the best case scenario would have been something near a draw. But I think a draw is kind of what Harris needed tonight because she wants the race probably to stay roughly where it is because that's probably the best case scenario coming out of a night like tonight.